The sun was hardly above the horizon when breakfast was finished and the dogs and cubs were fed. Then they were harnessed to the wagon, and boys, bears, dogs, and wagon all started on their way to the woods. Hickory trees did not grow plentifully in the bottom lands, so the boys made for the hills, perhaps a mile away. Shortly after they reached the hills, Jim cried out, "Oh, here's a great big shellbark! I'll bet the ground's covered with nuts." Sure enough, the ground was covered with them, and the boys filled their wagon in a very short time. Then they started home. The trip home was marred by an upset, owing to the perversity of the cubs, but the boys righted the wagon, loaded it with nuts again, and after considerable trouble deposited them safely at home and went back for another load. The dog-bear team worked admirably, barring a general tendency to run over logs and stones, and 2 great loads of hickory nuts were safely brought to the house before dinner. After the boys, bears, and dogs had eaten a hurried meal, they again went forth in quest of nuts. But they took a different course this time, toward the south, that is, in the direction of the house of Mr. Fox, for the purpose of visiting a hazel thicket, which was a mile from home. Soon the hazel patch was reached, and about 5 o'clock the wagon was full of beautiful brown little nuts, than which there is none sweeter. When the wagon was loaded, the boys hitched up the team, much to the delight of the latter, for by the time the dogs and cubs had come to think it great sport, and the caravan moved homeward. Soon after leaving the hazel patch, the boys entered a dark strip of woods and undergrowth, through which it was very hard work to draw the wagon. So they attached a long piece of tanned deerskin to the tongue of the wagon and gave the team a helping hand. There was but one path through this dark strip of forest over which the wagon could be drawn, and it led through a low piece of ground that was wet and marshy. Upon the soft earth of the path Balser soon noticed the long, broad tracks of a bear, and the dogs at once began to bark and plunge in their harnesses. The tracks appeared to Balser to be an hour old, so he quieted the dogs, but did not release them from the wagon as he should have done. The boys went forward, regardless of the warning bear tracks, and the dogs and bears, drawing the wagon, followed closely at their heels. As they proceeded, the bear tracks became fresher, and Balser began to grow somewhat fearful. Jim had become frightened, and had taken a position at the rear of the wagon to give a helping hand by pushing at the load. He said he could push better than he could pull anyway. After the little party had got well into the darkest part of the forest, the dogs began to show such evident signs of uneasiness that Balser grasped his gun and held it in readiness, prepared for a fight, should one become necessary. The ground had been frozen earlier in the day, but it had thawed, and the path was slippery. Balser, who was walking a short distance ahead of the train as a sort of advance guard, suddenly stopped and held up his hand warningly to Jim, for right ahead of him in the path stood a huge bear with its head turned backward, looking inquiringly in the direction of the boys. Jim at once stopped the team. The dogs, of course, were dancing with impatience to be released from the harness, and even the dull-witted bear seemed to realize that something was wrong. "It's running away," said Balser. "It's not safe to shoot at it from behind. I might wound it, and then we should be the ones to run. What shall we do?" "Let it run," answered Jim quickly. "I don't like to run with a bear after me anyway. If you're going to shoot, I'll run now so as to get a good start." "No, you don't. You stand right where you are and take care of the team. If you move a foot, I'll lick you," answered Balser. as he moved cautiously ahead in the direction of the retreating bear. Jim was frozen by fear to the spot upon which he stood, as Balser walked out of sight. In a moment he again heard Balser speak, and then he heard a loud, deep growl. The dogs barked and plunged. The cubs whined and gave forth savage little baby bear growls, half whines, for they were only learning to growl. Jim began to weep and to scream. Balser, who had disappeared from sight around a curve in the path, cried out, "Let the dogs loose! For goodness sake, Jim, it's after me!" The dogs seemed to understand Balser's cry better than Jim did, for they barked and plunged more violently than ever in their harness. Jim seemed dazed and could not, or at least did not, unharness the dogs. Then it was that the good dog sense of old Prince showed himself. Instead of waiting for help from Jim, who he saw had lost his wits, the good dog began to gnaw at the leather harness which held him and tied to the wagon, and in a short time the dogs were freed from the wagon, though still tied to each other. Tige caught inspiration from Prince, and the dogs backed away from each other and pulled with all their strength until the harness slipped over the head of Prince and let the dogs free. Then Prince plunged rapidly into the thicket to the rescue of his master, followed closely by Tige, dragging the broken harness. "Help! Help!" cried Balser. "Why don't you send the dogs?" And his voice seemed to be going farther and farther away. "Where are you?" cried Jim in despair. His terror was so strong upon him that he could not move, and he could not have helped Balser had he been able to go to him. Jim was a little fellow, you must remember. "Help! Help!" cried Balser again, his voice sounding from a still greater distance. "I've wounded it! It's about to kill me! Help! Help!" But the cries came fainter and fainter. Jim stood his ground and screamed manfully. Soon after Balser had left Jim and the wagon, the bear turned toward his pursuer and presented to Balser its broad side. This gave the boy a good chance for a shot. For the moment, Balser forgot his father's admonition to be deliberate and to act slowly, and his forgetfulness almost cost him his life. Balser shot and wounded the bear in the neck, but did not kill it. Then it turned, and Balser, fearing to run back upon the path lest he should bring the bear upon Jim, started into the thicket toward the river with the bear in hot pursuit. Balser gained rapidly upon the bear at first, but he knew that his advantage could not last, for the bear was sure to catch him soon. What should he do? He hastily went over in his mind the possibilities in the case, and soon determined to put forth his utmost speed to gain as much upon the bear as possible, and then to climb the first tree of the proper size to which he should come. With this intent, he flung his carbine over his back by a strap attached to the gun for that purpose, and ran for dear life. Soon the boy reached a small beech tree, the branches of which were 10 or 12 feet from the ground. Up this tree he climbed with the agility of a squirrel. He afterward said, "I was so badly scared that it seemed as if my hands and feet had claws, like a wild cat." The bear had followed so closely upon his track that just as the boy was about to draw himself up among the branches of the tree, the bear rose upon its hind legs and caught the boy's toes between his teeth. Balser screamed with pain and tried to draw his foot away, but the harder he pulled, the harder pulled the bear, and the pain was so great that he thought he could not stand it. While he clung to the limb with one hand, he reached toward the bear with the other and caught it by the nose. He twisted the bear's nose until the brute let loose of his foot. Then he quickly drew himself into the tree and seated himself, none too soon, astride of a limb. When Balser had fixed himself firmly on the limb, he proceeded at once to load his gun. This was no slight matter under the circumstances, for aside from the fact that his position in the tree was an uneasy one, the branches were in his way when he began to use his ramrod. Balser had hardly poured the powder into his gun when the bear again rose on its hind legs and put its front paws upon the body of the tree, with evident intent to climb after the boy who had wounded it and had so insultingly twisted its nose. Bears like to scratch the bark of trees, and seem to take the same pride in placing their marks high upon the tree trunks that a young man does in making a long jump or a good shot. Vanity, in this case, proved to be the bear's undoing, as it has often been with men and boys. When it was reaching upward to make a high scratch that it thought would be the envy of every bear that would see it, it should have been climbing, for while it was scratching, Balser was loading, not hurriedly, as he had shot, but slowly and deliberately, counting 1, 2, 3, with every movement. For when he had shot so hurriedly a few minutes before, and had only wounded the bear, he had again learned the great lesson to make haste slowly. The lesson was to be impressed upon Balser's mind more firmly than ever before he was through with the wounded bear. For to the day of his death he never forgot the events which befell him after he came down from the tree. Although Balser was deliberate, he had no time to waste, for soon the bear began climbing the tree, aided by a few small branches upon the lower part of the trunk, which had given help to Balser. Up the bear went slowly and surely. Its great red tongue hung out at one side of his mouth, and its black woolly coat was red and gory with blood from the wound that Balser had inflicted upon its huge neck. Its sharp little eyes were fixed upon Balser, and seemed to blaze with fury and rage, and its long bright teeth gleamed as its lips were drawn back in anger when it growled. Still the bear climbed, and still Balser was loading his gun. Would he have it loaded before the bear reached him? Now the powder was all in, a double charge. Now the first patch was in, and Balser was trying to ram it home. The branches of the tree were in his way, and the ramrod would not go into the gun. Inanimate things are often stubborn just when docility is most needed. At last the ramrod is in, and the first patch goes home hard and fast upon the powder.